Good afternoon. I'm Brian Zollner, and I would like to welcome you to the 2023 State of the River Report. This is the 16th version of the State of the River Report for the Lower St. Johns River Basin, and I'd like to start out by acknowledging the Jacksonville EPB for funding for this project. The River Report can be found on sjrreport.com, and this has been a interdisciplinary joint venture between Jacksonville University, UNF, and Penn State Berks. Just to give you a highlight, the website can be seen here, and the key aspects of the River Report can be found on the tabs on the left. If you click on one of them, the tributaries are of high interest because the tributaries can be tied to your particular local area and can localize some of the key issues that are in your particular area. Another aspect I think that the public would be interested in is the brochure, which is a user-friendly guide that goes through the key indicators of the river health, and that is out there and available on the website. And what I'd like to do now is hand it over to Dr. Charles Klossman, who will discuss aspects of the guide from a citizen's perspective.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zollner. So what I'll talk about right now is what's called the Guide for the General Public. And the Guide for the General Public and another chapter called the Background chapter, which has a lot of context and history and so forth. These chapters were updated this past year by Dr. Chris Baynard for the University of North Florida. What the Guide for the General Public really does is it provides a sort of practical understanding of what the overall State of the River Report is about. So it sort of talks about different features of the State of the River Report in one place. Another thing that the Guide for the General Public does is it gives some very practical advice on how to actually use the report in terms of where to volunteer, how to report pollution incidences in the St. Johns River, and so forth. So I'm going to walk through the Guide for the General Public right now and talk about some of these features. So first of all, one of the things we talk about in this Guide for the General Public is what the actual State of the River Report is. And just to sort of summarize it here, it summarizes the health of the river, where health refers to human well-being, recreation, environment, and economy. And I think it's really important to understand that we spend a lot of time talking about ecology and economy and water quality and invasive species and so forth. It's also important to understand how those things are related to human well-being, and especially things like recreation, fishing, and boating. So that's one of the features of the State of the River Report that's emphasized in this Guide for the General Public, since so many people like to go boating on the river and use and engage in recreation in other ways. The focus of the overall river report, and something mentioned in this General Public Report, is on water quality, aquatic life, fisheries, and contaminants. And what you see here is a map of the different tributaries investigated. As Dr. Zollner pointed out a couple minutes ago, I think it's really important that we're able to see things like water quality and the different qualities of these tributaries all over Northeast Florida, because we can sort of localize our understanding of what the river report has to say. The State of the River Report also gives guidance on a number of other things, and the rest of the team that's up here today is going to talk in depth about more of these things. For example, there's a new highlights chapter called The Past, Present, and Future of American Alligators in the Lower St. Johns River. This was written by Dr. Adam Rosenblatt at the University of North Florida. Dr. Zellner will also talk about some of the different lesson plans and materials for educators that are in the St. Johns River Report. So there's lesson plans for K through 12 teachers. One thing I want to mention, there is also in the educational section of the State of the River Report, there are links to oral histories that have been done with people who lived along the St. Johns River over the last 50 years, and so those are accessible as well. And then a significant portion of this Guide for the General Public concerns different ways that the public can get involved, from all sorts of things about fishing and boating, volunteer opportunities, and like I mentioned, places where you can report pollution incidences and things like this. So some of the takeaways and some of the practical advice that we get from reading the overall river report that's reflected in this guide for the general public. One, water quality in the main stem of the St. Johns River in Northeast Florida is generally suitable for boating, fishing, and other forms of recreation. And this is sort of an overall takeaway that we get when we read the different sections on tributaries and water quality and contaminants and so forth. It doesn't mean that there's not significant concerns, especially in some of the tributaries, but the overall news, I think, from a very practical standpoint in terms of fishing and recreation for the main stem of the river is pretty good news, and it has been for some time now. And once again, the rest of the team will elaborate on some of this. Another aspect of this good news is that there are plenty of the most popular fish to catch, especially for anglers, recreational fishermen. So there's plenty of redfish, plenty of sea trout, plenty of mullet, and other fish in the St. Johns River. Another aspect that you'll hear more about is that several species of animals that have been vulnerable and either endangered or threatened over the last several years are actually doing quite well right now. So you see a picture of a wood stork there. Wood storks are doing well in Northeast Florida, as are bald eagles. There's also an image of a manatee. Manatees have been doing fairly well from an overall standpoint over the last few years, but there's certainly some problems that have emerged, especially recently. And one of those problems, of course, is boat strikes, which is a significant source of manatee deaths in the lower St. Johns River Basin. There are also problems with declining submerged aquatic vegetation in some of the places where manatees live. And you've probably heard a lot about manatee deaths in the Indian River Lagoon. And I think Dr. Pinto might elaborate a little bit more on some of this later. But manatees are an area where there are some issues of concern. So some of the other issues of concern, you're going to hear more about tributaries. And the conditions in the tributaries are worrying, with high levels of fecal bacteria and phosphorus. And the number of tributaries along the St. Johns River which have been identified as being impaired under federal or state law, in other words, highly polluted for a variety of reasons, has actually increased slightly in the last few years. And as the river report mentions, there's high levels of phosphorus and fecal bacteria in a number of the different tributaries. Another issue of concern over the last few years has been high levels of salinity in the St. Johns River, and this is especially over the last 10 years with effects on submerged aquatic vegetation, and also wetlands are highly vulnerable due to development pressures. There are a number of ways to get involved. The report for the general public highlights a number of those different things. Some of those things include obviously reduce, reuse, recycle, don't throw things in storm drains, avoid throwing leaves, and obviously we don't want construction debris and waste going into storm drains because those things end up in our creeks and contribute to pollution in the tributaries in the St. Johns River. Use fertilizer responsibly and in a limited way. Report algal blooms or pollution. And volunteer and get involved with the St. Johns River. And the graphic you see on the left has a number of different ways to get involved with the river, and this graphic is included in the report for the general public. I want to talk just a little bit about the background chapter and highlight some new features that Dr. Baynard included in the last year especially. One is this land use land cover map that shows the percentage of the lower St. Johns River Basin that's covered with wetlands, forested areas, and urban areas, and he used GIS techniques to highlight using different colors. And so what you can see here is the red area is urban areas, the green is forested areas, and the light blue is generally wetlands. A couple of the other new graphics that Dr. Baynard included in the background section included a map of the historic range of the Timucua Indians, which you see on the left, produced by Dr. Keith Ashley and Dr. Denise Bosey at the University of North Florida. And on the right, a map of the salinity ranges along the St. Johns River, the lower St. Johns River Basin. So these are some of the new features that Dr. Baynard added in the past year. Finally, some acknowledgments. I won't read all of these, but this is a number of people that are involved with the River Report team, and I want to give special acknowledgments to Nikki Spadaro, who's the technical editor for the St. John's River Report, who does an incredible amount of work on this. Also, Shelby Scanlon at UNF, who works long and hard on the website, and of course, Dr. Pinto, who's the principal investigator from JU. Anyway, thank you very much.
And thank you, Dr. Klossman. My section, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the educational resources that are available. The River Report really is a rich resource for K-12 applications. And I want to highlight some of the key aspects of it and some of the initiatives we have as part of the River Report. So if you're an educator and you're looking for materials that can be useful to you as a teacher, you can see that you can navigate to it pretty clearly from the website for the River Report. And there's three key goals that we have for the education outreach that we do with the River Report. One is to improve scientific literacy. And what's great about the River Report is really a rich context to do that, because there are lots of data sources for students to look at. And we'll talk more about that with the focus on scientific literacy on the next slide. A key goal we have for the project is also to help support K-12 materials with instructional materials. And we've developed several kinds and different topics. And then finally, to share lessons for primary and secondary school teachers to actually use. These are all editable materials that can be adapted to your particular classroom or your particular school in the area. So when thinking of that first goal around scientific literacy, we're really looking at four particular areas. The first is really thinking about collaboration, allowing students to work together to interpret data, to examine data, and to make sense of that particular data. The second key component that we think about when we think about scientific literacy is representation, how that data is represented. And it can take lots of different forms depending on what kind of analysis whether it's a scientist using it or a student using it to make sense of the world around them. It's really looking at those different kinds of representations that then lead to our third particular focus, which is interpretation, how students can interpret the data in order to make evidence-based claims. From that understanding of the information that's out there, what students can do is develop evidence-based solutions to problems that they see in everyday situations that they see around them. So it could be algal blooms, it could be issues with rising tides, but what we're really trying to get students to do is not just take a guess at what should be the solution. It's actually using data that's out there that is presented in areas like the River Report to make a good recommendation and help them develop into scientifically literate citizens. So there's four big areas that I'm going to focus on that we've developed, and then also a fifth area, which are some additional resources that provide opportunities for educators to use. The first is some educational video clips that I'll talk about in a couple minutes. Data visualizations, K-12 lesson plans, service learning examples, and then, like I mentioned earlier, the fifth will be some additional resources that are out there for that will continue to be developed and for educators to develop. So the first one is the educational video clips. And these are really useful introductions to lessons, and they really provide authentic pieces of information with scientists and folks from the area talking about particular topics, and make these topics both localized, but then they also make it very interesting. And so we think of like really interesting critters like manatees, which a lot of folks have a lot of interest in, but there's certainly the personal aspects like microplastics and items that as a student or an educator can use to enact change in their particular area. I also want to note the environmental history component. There's videos from local folks who have shared their experiences living along the river. That, again, it's that firsthand local material that can really serve as good kickoffs for students to become much more engaged in the river basin. Second component that we have is the data visualizations, and these are really useful because these maps can help students connect particular impairments or issues So, for instance, sanitary sewage overflows, impaired waters. And what becomes really powerful with this is that students can connect this data to the neighborhoods that they live in. So once again, it answers that question, how does this stuff relate to me? It relates to them because these things are actually happening within their neighborhood, and they may likely have an ability to enact change or at least get engaged with it. And then these data visualizations can be found throughout the River Report. Another aspect that we've been working with is also developing K-12 lesson plans. We've got several primary K through 6 lesson plans, again, fully editable, that can be used and adapted to your classroom. And then also some secondary lesson plans. And every lesson plan has a connection to the Florida state standards and the national standards. It's got key intended learning outcomes and objectives. There's a key rationale for the lesson. It makes that case for your students of why they should be learning what they're learning. PowerPoint presentations, and then teacher notes to give some guidance to the teachers to let them know what questions they might want to ask, some issues that might arise, and concerns they should start to think about. The service learning examples that we have on the website, I think, is really exciting, and this is really a joint venture with Dr. Nisa Goldberg's students at Jacksonville University. And these examples are lessons that her students, these college students, have developed as teams that basically allow students to, and an audience to, engage with the river in pretty meaningful ways. So each of these service learning examples has a hook with photos to really engage the audience. Key background information that allows the audience to understand what can be pretty difficult material to digest. Data interpretation exercises, so it folds back to that goal we have for scientific literacy, of being able to take the data that they see in the report and make sense of it, and then some sort of assessment or test of that particular understanding that goes along with that. And I think these lessons are really engaging and again, can be really useful in lots of different settings, but especially K-12 settings. And then finally, we have material links, and as we develop the River Report, these links get added to and modified. There's materials that deal with resiliency, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that later. Links with different responses and quick links to different issues that are occurring across along the river, and quick data points, and then opportunities for community engagement. When we think of getting kids to be interested in things like the environment, these active community engagement type activities can be real hooks for students to work on. So again, I do want to acknowledge Dr. Nisi Goldberg's students and Dr. Jerry Pinto for the work that we do here. And I will be handing it off to Dr. Scott Jones, who's going to talk about water quality.
Thank you, Dr. Zollner. So as Dr. Zollner mentioned, I'll be giving a brief overview of some of the water quality parameters that we report on in the River Report. There is a lot more information that we can't go into in such a short period of time. So I suggest, if you're interested in getting more information on some of the nutrient parameters or other metals or concentrations of pharmaceuticals and other things that Dr. Pinto will touch on a bit later, please go to the website or download the full report. You can see these things by specific tributaries, for example, which we won't be able to cover today. So in general, if we're looking at these 4 parameters out of the many, again, that we report on and collate all of the data collected, I'll talk first about dissolved oxygen. So thanks to Dr. Gretchen Bielmeyer, who actually leads and writes, analyzes that section in the River Report. Things are largely satisfactory in the main stem of the Lower St. Johns River, and the tributaries, not so much. Unsatisfactory overall status, but those trends have remained unchanged over time. I'll get into nitrogen and phosphorus in the slides that follow, but nitrogen overall looks pretty good in the main stem and the tributaries. It's gone down since the late 90s, Over the last 10 years or so, though, we may have some concerns. I'll show some figures for that. And for phosphorus, the main stem is satisfactory in its status, but as has been mentioned already a few times, the tributaries give us some concern, and some of the main stem actually may be worsening over time with regards to phosphorus concentrations. And algal blooms really were most concerned in the freshwater portion of the main stem compared to the estuarine or marine section. So for dissolved oxygen, you can see in the main stem, both in the freshwater portion, so upstream, and in the marine or saltier portions, more towards Mayport and downtown Jacksonville, we have values that are higher than the water quality criteria. So dissolved oxygen is a little unique in that we want our data to be above the criteria. Usually we don't want values higher than a water quality criteria, but the more dissolved oxygen you have in the water, that is helpful for organisms that live in the water that need that oxygen to carry out what they do, growing and reproducing and supporting our economy and recreation and ecology. So in the main stem, we don't really have much concern. You can see the data is above those lines for water quality criteria. As we move into the tributary, you can see a lot of our data points, especially early on in the time series, so towards the left of this graph, are overlapping with these water quality criteria. So we have lower dissolved oxygen typically in the tributaries than in the main stem. We have more concern, at least seasonally or at certain times of day, that we have low dissolved oxygen. And again, that makes that more difficult for organisms that live in the tributaries or in the main stem to carry out their life cycles. And throughout all of the nutrient section, we choose parameters to talk about one at a time, but there are all of these very difficult and interesting interactions between things like dissolved oxygen and nutrient concentrations or pH of the water. So if you have low dissolved oxygen, you may have much higher phosphorus concentrations compared to if you have higher dissolved oxygen. So that makes disentangling the effects and actually measuring change over time in these parameters to be quite difficult. For nutrients, this is total nitrogen on the left and total phosphorus. This is in the main stem. Instead of time on the X, which we usually show, so this is not over time, this is over space. So towards the left of these graphs is the mouth of the lower St. John, so Mayport, and you're going upstream as you go to the right. So depending on where you are in space in our basin, you have on average a lower or higher nutrient concentration. And again, this is just in the main stem, not considering the various tributaries of which we have so many. So typically we have less nitrogen in the saltier sections of the main stem and more in the fresh. Saltier systems are nitrogen limited typically. We have almost the opposite pattern in phosphorus, where there's lower phosphorus in the freshwater portions of our system, and as you get towards the mouth and salinity increases, you get higher phosphorus with a bump right around the city of Jacksonville. That may or may not be coincidental. Looking just at the total nitrogen data over the full time series that we look at, so from 1997 till 2022, last year's data, we can see that the long-term trends across the tributaries and the main stem are good. We have decreases in nitrogen over the long term over the past 25 years or so. So overall, nitrogen concentrations have been going down over the decadal time scale. If we look, however, at the last 10 years, there has not been much change, right? You can see that these lines, the data points, are flat, essentially. So we are not continuing to decrease our total nitrogen concentration over time in the last 10 years, although, right, over the last few decades, we've seen improvement. We have some concern that there may be increases starting to happen in the tributaries, but we'll need a few more years of data to see if that trend continues or if it's just variability in the data. Switching to phosphorus, we see a very different picture. Over the long term, there has not been much change overall, at least detectable change, in total phosphorus concentrations. You can see these lines are essentially flat, even over the long term. There's variability from year to year, but the tributaries have overall higher concentrations of phosphorus, and on average, those concentrations are right around the water quality standard that we compare to, although be sure to note that this is not the water quality standard, that these water bodies are regulated by, that is a load, which is not directly comparable. But to put it into perspective, we have higher concentrations in the tribs. The freshwater main stem has the lowest concentrations right now of total phosphorus. Again, over the last 10 years, we do have some cause for concern in the overall basin and in the tributaries. We think we may start to detect some increases in total phosphorus, which we'll be tracking quite closely over the next few years. So this shows seasons now, or month on the X, just to show that in the main stem and in the tributaries for total phosphorus and nitrate, which is one version of nitrogen we measure, or we collate. The state agencies do a great job of actually measuring that. There are seasonal patterns. So depending on if you sample in July versus January, you're going to see a different concentration of these nutrients. So this really is to highlight how difficult it is to get a good picture of nutrient concentrations in our watershed because we have such a large area to cover and sample, and things are changing every day, seasonally and year to year based on rainfall and how warm it was, how many storms we had. So to wrap up the nutrient water quality section that I'll be talking about, we'll talk a little bit about chlorophyll A. Now, that may seem like an interesting thing to talk about, but why are we talking about chlorophyll A? Really, that is a proxy or tells us something about algae and algal blooms. So chlorophyll A is the way that we measure those. It's correlated with how many algal cells typically you have on average. You can see that in the marine section or the estuarine section of our estuary, we have lower concentrations typically of chlorophyll A than in the freshwater. So algal blooms, especially harmful algal blooms and high chlorophyll concentrations, is something that we're more concerned about in the freshwater portion of the lower St. John's. If we look at the geometric means, which is how we compare these to the water quality standards, you can see, again, lower concentrations in the marine, but we are below those since 2019. So on average, we are lower than concerning water quality criterion, although there is not much change over time in these patterns. And I should say that this is led by Dr. Dale Kazamata at the University of North Florida, who analyzed the chlorophyll A and algal section. So this shows the variability that we're dealing with. This is a log scale on the Y here. So we have between maybe 2 and then over 100 the concentration of chlorophyll A at any one time. So there's a lot of variability in these data. It's difficult to capture with one sample at one time point the variability in algae in a mixed body of water. This is one example of how we're moving forward across different data types. So this is an example for algae and algal bloom network. You can see where blooms are happening across the state. There's a dashboard here, and you can look and see if there's one active in your area, which organisms might be causing that. It's a dashboard to collate lots of different data from different agencies, FWC, FDEP. We're starting to move towards this for lots of different data parameters in the basin, which is a really good sign. It helps us analyze the data and make recommendations. It also helps managers and regulators have a clear picture, real time, of what's going on in the basin. And I will leave you all with a little quote from Dale about algal blooms, as that's something of interest to a lot of folks. Algal blooms are on the rise, likely due to anthropogenic or human influence. In other words, increased nutrient levels, climate change, especially temperature, alterations to physical environments, etc. And without ameliorative strategies, algal blooms will likely continue to become more problematic as time progresses. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Nisa Goldberg, who will talk to us about non-native species and wetlands.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I do recommend you look at those educational resources to learn how to interpret some of these graphs and charts that we cover, especially those box and whisker charts. So I'm covering the non-natives and wetland indicators. It's important to note that non-native species are not necessarily invasive species. Those that are invasive are ones that can modify the ecosystem in a negative way. Currently, it's estimated there are about 100 species in the lower St. Johns River Basin, but that is an underestimate due to more need to do surveying to look for these species. Of those, over 65% are freshwater species. And if you're wondering how they ended up in our area, major contributors were from the shipping industry. It may be that they release ballast water in the coastal waters, or they could have just hijacked, hanging on to the hulls of the ships, and then they fell off, and then they ended up in our river. Other sources are the aquarium trade, pet industry. These are species that may have escaped or may have been purposely released by people into our neighborhoods, and then they spread. So overall, it's considered unsatisfactory, the status, on account of needing more data to accurately know the number of non-native species. But the conditions are worsening, in particular with changing of our climate, warmer temperatures, so species can move north that were more typically found perhaps in southern Florida. Okay, moving on to wetlands. As mentioned earlier, we saw the figure on the right, which shows the coverage of wetlands. Those are in light blue. It's approximately 23 to 24% of the lower St. Johns River Basin. And those wetlands can be marine, freshwater, or estuarine. There are a whole diverse array of wetlands. They contribute to diversity. They can be forested as well as non-forested. So they can be prairies, the marshes that you're more perhaps thinking of when you're near the mouth of the St. Johns River. But what they all do is share proximity to the water table. So those roots are accessing fresh water. And so all the diversity of forms of wetlands contribute to diversity of the vegetation, but it also contributes to local diversity for those migratory species, organisms that spend part of their life cycle in the wetlands. And all that also feeds the recreational industry, tourism, fishing, and those are all really important in terms of a wetland ecosystem service. But there are other ecosystem services that perhaps you may be thinking about when you think of our extreme storm events, when we have these extreme floods or the nuisance high tides. Those wetlands, they help slow that water down from reaching the main stem and tributaries. But they also, as that runoff enters the wetlands, there are protectors. So as the roots, they can take up those excess nutrients, and that's where they get the reputation of being like a sponge and taking up nutrients and keeping our waters clean in that respect. Okay, so for direct pressures on our wetlands, sadly, with these extreme storm events, you're hearing about neighborhoods that are impacted by flooding, but they also impact those wetlands that are right adjacent to the waterway. So this, in addition to those nuisance high tides, also with sea level rise, and then just storm events with runoff. We talked a little bit, our team, about the sanitary sewer overflows. So that's when you can have these overflows that then can release nutrients into waterways. Usually they, go in and manage those overflows, but if that water reaches the wetlands, then they have excess nutrients, and those can then end up into our main waterways. Wetlands are also suffering from direct pressures with habitat modification. So it could be those invasive species, but it's also due to human impacts, due to development, which I'll go into later. But it's the dredge and fill activities that are modifying wetlands at the landscape level. So each project may be, following the wetland rules, but across the landscape, we're losing wetlands. Okay, on a bright note, in 2022, we did add some acreage. These were in state managed lands. So where wetlands are protected, it can be on private, federal, state, local levels. And in this case, it was the state managed lands that added quite a number of acres. Okay, so I talked a little bit about development. When a project is going to impact wetland acreage, then the leaders are going to have to put in for environmental resource permit, and that's through the St. Johns River Report. And so that database, which I thank them for having, I use to then pull together patterns. Okay, so in this figure is pulled from those ERPs, and on the x-axis are years and number of permits per year, and then with the dotted line is the total acreage of impacted wetlands. So in 2022, it was approximately 430 impacted wetland acreage. And then in the bars, based on color, you can see how those impacted wetlands through dredge and fill activities were mitigated. So what activities did they do to mitigate the impacts of wetlands? And so it could be either on or off site of that project. It could be wetland or upland preservation, enhancement, creation, or restoration. So creation is the only one where wetlands would be added. Of the others, it's more to preserve, enhance, or restore. However, if there is a reason where they cannot do any of those four options, then mitigation bank credits may be purchased. So now focusing on the mitigation bank, if you look on the figure on the right in the neon green, that's where those mitigation banks are located. And so if that project is going to dredge or fill a wetland, and the mitigation option is to purchase mitigation bank credits, in 2022, 89 of the 102 permits, that is the option that was taken. So the projects are in one location, but the mitigation bank purchase of those credits are another. And so that was a total of 143 mitigation bank credits purchased. And you can see overwhelmingly that is the option. In 2022 as well, if you look on this figure, on the x-axis is year, and the y is the permits. And then the different colors are relating to the total impacted wetland acreage per permit. So in general, the impacted wetland acreage is less than 11 per permit. In 2022, there were 3 projects that had over 20 impacted wetland acreage per permit, and this represented almost 18% of the total wetland acreage. And the activities in general for those 3 were for building new housing, as I'm sure you're aware if you're driving through Jacksonville area, and mass grading road construction. Okay, so overall, the wetland status is unsatisfactory and the condition is worsening. And that's due to the continued pressure of development, which ends up a loss of wetland acreage. And then with that option of purchasing mitigation bank credits, we're losing those wetlands and the important ecosystem services they provide. And instead, those are being moved to those mitigation bank locations. On a positive, I always like to end on a positive. You know, there are opportunities for land buyouts so we can increase the surface area of wetlands in our area. Habitat restoration, thanks to Groundwork Jacksonville. And I'm sure you saw that there's a new resiliency report. I looked through it and over 50 plus mentions of wetlands, so very important. And we hope through those efforts that we can reverse those conditions that we're seeing. Thank you, and I will now move it on to Dr. Pinto.
Robert. So I will go straight into some of the areas that I report on. One of them is salinity, and this graph shows you the gauge at the Buckman Bridge that the USGS operates of high-frequency data. And you can see over the long term, we're looking at salinity increasing. There are various other things that have occurred in the basin due to man's activities, like dredging, for example, that have added to that over time. But the status of salinity is unsatisfactory and worsening because of the long-term effects. A great deal of this is probably due to sea level rise. And here are some of the impacts from salinity. So our various salinity zones can change and move. There's going to be a redistribution of freshwater fish, particularly those associated with the SAV. Here stands for the submerged aquatic vegetation in the river. That vegetation likes freshwater conditions. There may be some life cycle disruptions with the crabs in the river, which is our main fishery. Macroinvertebrate populations may shift because of that. But for the main part, if we lose submerged aquatic vegetation, that would certainly impact manatees because that's their main food supply. You may have also noticed the loss of certain cypress trees in the river, and that may be because of salinity stress or salt stress that's killing them. Moving on to FIBs, fecal indicator bacteria. This is where most of our problems are. They tend to be in the tributaries with high levels of exceedance in fecal indicator bacteria. So on this table here, we have about 56 tributaries that we have data on. 29 of them have basin management action plans to address those bacterial loads. If you look at the numbers, you can see that many of them, in fact, all of them are in exceedance of the water quality criteria. I think the best one is Trout River Middle, that's about 27%, and then the worst one in this list is Miller Creek with 100% exceedance. So we have some serious problems in the tributaries with bacteria. The main stem of the river, though, is satisfactory. In 2018, FDEP did some source tracking. So this was to try to determine where the bacteria are coming from and who the culprits are, basically. On the right, you see a map there showing you the 60+ thousand septic tanks that exist in our watershed. So the source tracking was to determine whether the bacteria is coming from animals or it's coming from people, and if it's coming from people, is it untreated or treated? Out of that, a priority list was developed, and that's what's in this table over here. Most of the, some of that source tracking indicated that there was raw sewage or untreated sewage in the downtown north side area. So that's why the first three on this list are north side neighborhoods. So since 2016, a great deal of funds have been directed at trying to phase out septic tanks in these areas. And so that project is moving along quite well, actually. In addition to that, we have nutrient loading that comes from SSOs, and we talked about this earlier, sanitary sewer overflows. So JEA is the company that looks after our wastewater and sewage, and so these sanitary sewer overflows are occurring because of old infrastructure and failing old infrastructure. So pipe burst, pump goes out, that kind of thing. We get hit by a storm. Some of these things happen. You can see that the volume in 2022 is down, which is a good thing. In addition, on this map, you'll also see some stars, and those are biosolids disposal sites. So once sewage is processed, it's made into pellets, and sometimes those pellets are disposed of on land to compost them or get rid of them. We are worried that some of those nutrients may be entering water systems, and so our analysis over time will focus on trying to determine how much of that is coming from biosolids disposal sites. Our fisheries, for the most part, are good, and most of you probably know that our biggest fishery in the St. Johns River is crabs, blue crabs, over 80%. The rest are finfish that are mainly mullet, and other species that were mentioned earlier that people like to fish for. Another important part of the St. Johns is the SAV, or the submerged aquatic vegetation. So this is mainly in the freshwater parts of the river, and these grasses provide tremendous ecosystem services in those areas. They're nursery and shelter basically for many species. They absorb nutrients and they reduce erosion. The problem is that they're very sensitive to salinity increases or water clarity increase or turbidity increases. So this is something that seems to have happened more in the last few years with increased water levels. So the grasses are not getting as much light as they did before. Another thing that's emerged, that since the storms, the grasses have been beaten back quite strongly, and they're having trouble recovering. Predation pressure is something that has emerged as another factor that's keeping them from recovering quickly. On the right-hand side, you'll see some figures. Most of this data is collected by the Water Management District. Gives you an idea of the level of sampling that they do. Those figures kind of give you an idea of how many sampling sites that are being used to collect this data. And occasionally aerial observation also helps us to anecdotally tell how well the grass beds are doing. And they don't seem to be doing too well, certainly in the northern part of the basin. You have to remember, in the northern part of the basin, we have a lot more salinity stress. And these graphs here, I know there's a lot of graphs, but if you look at the dark green line, that sort of tells you where the outer edge of the beds are, how far the grass beds stretch out from the shore. And then the light green tells you how much grass is actually there if you take away all the bare patches. And you can see the declines over time that have occurred in those. You'll notice, though, in all these graphs, though, there's a little slight uptick in 2022, which shows that there's some recovery going on. The top two graphs here on the right refer to the northern part of the basin, and the bottom two graphs on the right refer to south of the Buckman Bridge. So you'll notice that the lengths of the grass beds are about 40 meters in the northern part, and they're about double that in the southern part. And that's because of the salinity stress. There's less salinity stress going on in the southern part here, so the grasses are able to grow better. These two graphs here on the left show you the amount of Vallisneria, or the tape grass, the manatee grass, makes up of those grass communities and how well it's doing. This is moving further south in the river, and you see pretty much the same sort of thing. But if you pay attention to the green lines, you can see the decline in grass bed length there over time. Same thing here for the northern part of the area above Palatka. Grasses below Palatka are very different because the river is very narrow there and very different there, and color is a lot more of an issue with the grasses getting enough light there. Again, you can see declines in those lines. And then this is Vallisneria. And then this graphic is quite telling. This comes out of the Water Management District. And it talks about the length of the grass beds. And you can see that and the size of those circles tell you about how much grass is present. And you can see that we've lost a lot of the green there as we go forward in time, which is quite disheartening to see. Our endangered and threatened species, or species of special concern, are doing well in the long term. In the short term, if you look at what happened since Hurricane Irma came through, they've been taking a beating, but the long-term trend is up. I will also say that manatees in general in the state have gone through a difficult time, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Klossman, in the Indian River Lagoon with the deaths that occurred due to starvation. It seems that last week the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have determined that they're going to open up a review period for the next 90 days to look at whether manatees should be reclassified as endangered. They were, if you recall, classified as threatened back in 2017. So the status of these species is, in our area anyway, is improving. A little bit about contaminants in the river, and here Dr. Gretchen Bielmeyer heads up this section, and she's looking at contaminants in the water column and in the sediment. So here in the water column, in the freshwater section, we have things like silver and selenium that are a problem and unsatisfactory. In the saltwater section, we have things like copper and silver that are unsatisfactory. And you'll notice that in the tributaries, most of the metals are unsatisfactory if we can find data on them. Data tends to be pretty limited on metals in the tributaries. Here's an example of metals in the sediments, and here we're talking about mercury. And the trend is actually down for mercury in the sediments, but you can see that from the bars there, or the whiskers on here, that there are a number of high exceedances that trip the water quality criteria. Polychlorinated biphenyls are another thing that are a contaminant in the tributaries, and individually their levels are low and persistent. But cumulatively, they trip the threshold, and so these are unsatisfactory as well. Most of the time, these legacy pollutants are okay as long as they're not disturbed. But any time you do something like dredging or a big storm comes through, the water column will revolatize these things or resuspend these things into the water, and they can become a problem then. Organochlorine pesticides. Very little data on those, so there's not much we can say about those, particularly in the sediments. In the water column, however, over the last 8 years, those have been increasing. And so this is unsatisfactory and worsening. And then finally, Dr. Bielmeyer has looked at pharmaceuticals in the water column. So these are not regulated at all at the moment, but to get a kind of idea of what the levels are and how they're doing, you can see here she looked at acetaminophen, ibuprofen, and hydrocodone. And so this gives us some indication of what those baselines are so far. And from an academic point of view, they're very interesting to all of us. With that, I think I will finish and pass it back to our moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Pinto. And I know we'll address some questions, but on behalf of the team, I do want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Please join ADAPT on November 8th at WJCT Studios for a discussion with the City of Jacksonville's Mayor and Chief Resilience Officer about the recently released Resilient Jacksonville Report. Please register at wjct.org/events.
We do have some questions. Are there any waterways we need to avoid completely right now because of algae blooms?
To chime in on that. There was some sampling done at the end of the last month, literally 2 weeks ago, and some harmful algae blooms were detected, or toxins from those were detected in Doctor's Lake. I cannot remember what the levels of that were, but that's the only place that we have some mention of toxic algae. There were other samples taken in Ortega River and the main stem of the St. Johns River and down towards the Shands Bridge. And although algae was discovered, they weren't toxic algae blooms. They were mixed species mainly.
Dr. Zellner, are the education materials under a Creative Commons license?
That's a great question. They are not. They're up currently, and certainly have permission from me to edit. But that's a great question. But at this point, they are editable, but not under Creative Commons.
Thank you. To what degree will sea level rise caused by climate change impact salinity and its distribution in the St. Johns River? Are there projections, and if so, what do they look like?
Question. There's a gauge at Mayport that that NOAA sort of operates, and there's if you go to that online, it'll produce a nice graph for you that will show you sea level rise over the last since 1929, 1930. It's been about an inch per decade over that time period. But what's interesting is to look at how quickly that line is increasing recently, because the rate of sea level rise is going to be different in different parts of the world. And Florida is one of those parts where it's increasing faster than in other places. So we don't know exactly what that's going to turn out to be, but we know that it's increasing at a faster rate each year.
And what's that web address again? I'll put it in the chat. Or where I can find it.
It's the NOAA gauge. Maybe Scott, I don't know if you know what it is. It's the NOAA gauge, the Mayport gauge.
If you go to NOAA Tides and Currents, they have a nice map viewer. You can click into Florida, and then you can zoom into our area, and it's the Mayport bar pilot gauge.
Great. Jennifer wants to know, what are the target amounts for nitrogen and phosphorus? Why is it not okay that it's level over the last 10 years?
That's a great question. So it's a complicated answer, I think. So the St. Johns River is not regulated based on water concentrations, which is what we present as the water quality criteria or standards. So it is regulated by loads, sort of on a basin scale, the huge numbers. So like 1 million kilograms of total nitrogen per year. So it's regulated in a way so that we can have specific inputs that are lower than what we think the load should be at a system scale, sort of a really, really large landscape scale, to reduce those concentrations that we would see in the river. But it's not regulated in a very specific place based on the water quality criteria. So we present that to have a comparison to other water bodies that are regulated on those standards, so that we know sort of where the river is at. Is it trending in a positive direction, which would actually be a negative direction, so lower concentrations, or is it getting worse? Are we hovering around, what is a marker of health in other systems? So to start answering, I want to first say that it's not regulated by those criteria. It is not necessarily a bad thing to have nitrogen be flat if it's below the water quality standard and if the system has the same concentration of nitrogen that it adapted to over the last few millennia, that would be fine, right? We don't need it to continually be going down forever and always. With how much eutrophication pressure our coastal systems are getting globally, I think generally almost all coastal systems, especially with a major city, could use a little more reduction than we've seen. But compared to where we were at least where the data were at in the late 90s, we're in a better place generally on nitrogen.
I think I would really agree with that. The other thing is we have these programs that are going on to remove septic tanks or move them onto sewer. Leaking septic tanks is another source of nitrogen, so that should help to ameliorate some of that nitrogen load into the river. The other thing you have to remember is not all of the nitrogen that we have comes from us. It comes from further south or upstream. And so getting an idea of how much that is another pretty complex question in itself.
To what degree are coal power plants, and especially those, sorry, it's two-part, especially United Coal ash landfills, such as those at St. John's River Power Park and 8 groundwater monitoring wells, 7. Sorry, that question got cut off. To what degree are the coal power plants and ash landfills contributing?
So a lot of these ash sites or incinerator sites or brownfield sites contribute heavy metals. Might be something that those are contributing to the waterways. As we alluded to in the report, there's very little data on some of that information. So there are some plans that are out there that the city has to look at those. Whether they've actually been implemented to their fullest, I don't know yet, but we certainly would like more data on that. One of the particular areas that we'd like to focus on in the future is the Trout Ribault River system, to look at the effects of old ash sites and so forth on those waterways.
James asks, are you familiar with the Florida Right to Clean Water voter initiative to get an amendment to the state constitution to include a basic right to clean water? And if so, are you sharing this initiative with your students? Do you agree with the premise?
I guess to the second part of that question, I teach a coastal ecosystem ecology class right now, and I'm always happy to share any information that they may find valuable to get them engaged in understanding our coastal systems better.
And also find most of our contact information for the team on the website. So if you have any nuggets like that to share with us, we'd be very happy to hear from you. So please share that with us. Yep.
Mangroves with a typical northern limit of St. Augustine have begun to grow on marshlands around the intersection of the river and intercoastal waterway. Is this result of the northern flow from intercoastal waterway from the seeds from Hurricane Irma, or increased salinity, or a combination? Do you know?
I'm actually studying mangroves more near St. Augustine. Initially, we thought that they were spreading offshore, going along the coast, but what we're finding is you have these populations, they release their propagules, and they move maybe up the intercoastal waterway or the river, not the St. John's River necessarily, and then they move. So they don't move too far from their parent population, and so it's a northern spread. It has been documented to have crossed the river into, I think, Little Talbot, Huguenots, but it's primarily more often the case that there is a population and then those propagules move. It could be with extreme storm events, but yeah, they're not necessarily moving. Although we do see them on the beaches, they're not necessarily moving that way. Did you want to add?
So I think right now the northern limit is on the Nassau of mangroves. So there's black mangroves right there on the border of Duval and Nassau counties right now. So it's a little north of St. Augustine, even for red mangroves at the moment.
Earl wondered if the redfish and sea trout are safe to eat near the Mayport area.
I would eat the fish near the Mayport area, so I guess they are safe to eat. We looked at mercury in fish tissue some years ago. Actually, the city did that, and Dr. Lucy Sonnenberg looked at some of that. And we were particularly interested in the size of fish that people were catching and consuming. And it turned out that most of those levels were below the thresholds. So we were very happy to hear that.
Andrew wondered, did any other organization check quality of Big Pottsburg Creek besides JEA after last month's wastewater spill?
Now that's interesting. That's usually that has to be reported to the DEP. But I think after the spill, JEA usually goes in, they do the cleanup, they monitor for several days before, during, and after, or during and after the event. And when the water quality is back to normal, then they remove the signs saying that there was an impairment there. So I don't know that there's other organizations like the DEP going in and retesting to check their results. Sort of defeat. I don't think that that's done, but so I don't think so. I think we rely on JEA to do a good job of cleaning up their messes.
What role, if any, does or can citizen science play in data collection for the State of the River report?
Well, I think that was mentioned with the algae bloom. There's EdMaps that where you can note invasive species that you've seen, as well as reporting SSOs. Are there others? But citizen science, very important. We rely on you to help collect the data.
Yeah, and I think there's, I know the National Park Service is working on some water quality monitoring stations that are a lot easier to put together, cheaper than the really expensive ones we have to try to purchase in academia. And you can put it on your dock and see what the water quality is doing. They're working on pushing that forward. So one of the big problems, and I think folks would agree with me, but please don't if you don't agree with me, we're really lacking data in a lot of places at a lot of times, and that's not for lack of effort. There's a ton of data collected in our basin by agencies, but there's only so many people and so much time to collect so many samples. So having citizens and non-citizens, whoever, people on the landscape out there looking at their water bodies, collecting water quality data, or getting involved with the Riverkeeper and other organizations that are bringing people in to try to set up fecal coliform testing, and any of those observations by the public is really helpful, because we have in some tributaries like 3 sampling stations and they're spread out. And if we have people in the gaps, it can really push us forward in a way that we're stuck at right now.
An example of, I conduct manatee surveys, and we fly along the river and look for manatees and count them. But we have a lot of tree overhang in Duval County along some of these narrow creeks and tributaries, so we're never going to count all the manatees that are out there. At best, I'd say we probably, on a good day, would count 60% of what's out there. And the rest, we rely on the public to call in and say, oh, we've got a manatee at our dock, or we've got a group of manatees doing this or that in this area. And so that helps us to fill in those data gaps. That's just one example. There are other examples. You have organizations like the St. John's Riverkeeper that are out there. They have a network of volunteers that help collect all kinds of data all over the basin. It's not uncommon for someone to call and say, I've got an algae bloom off my dock. Can somebody come and check if it's a problem or not? And they can help initiate some of those actions. So citizen science is incredibly important. And one of the main things about this report is to give citizens the tools to identify when something is wrong and report it.
And at the State of the River Report website, can they find where they can report this to, who to call?
Yeah, in fact, the brochure that we mentioned earlier at the beginning of our streaming here has all those phone numbers and those links that you can go to, and they're also on the website as well.
And last but not least, and this kind of leads into Eric's question, is what are some specific interventions or suggestions to address the issues laid out in the presentation? Do you have any?
Education is very important. It's one of those things, it's like a boiling kettle. If you stop boiling it, it stops boiling and people forget. And you have to keep educating and re-educating and letting people know what the issues are. I think, Brian, maybe you have some points on this, because this is your area.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Pinto makes a really good point there, that education's a key part of it. I think awareness is a big thing too. So I mean, it's one thing to drive over and see a different color in the river, or dead fish and things like that, but it's another thing to actually understand why it's happening, and is that a concerning thing, is that a natural thing. And do want to echo Jerry as well on if there's any interest that you have or any questions you have, please reach out to us, because we're really willing to work with you on those particular items. Thank you very much, and hope to hear from you soon.